우리 사단 동쪽 정면에 13년대가 부닥쳤는데
On the east side of our division, the 13th Regiment was challenged. The T-34 was the tank which had been used by the Soviet Union during the Second World War. At the time, our 1st Division did not have any particular weapons to counter that, and we suffered considerable difficulties.
상당히 고전을 했습니다.
Kim Il-sung broadcast 24 hours later, accusing the South Koreans of an all-out attack along the parallel. A North Korean map shows this version. South Korean officers did claim the early capture of one point, Haeju, just north of the parallel.
I never quite knew what went on. There's a bit of a mystery still about Haeju. I think it may have been Pak and his merry men in the 17th Regiment attacking it. It could have been some of them fighting their way to get back into South Korea. We didn't hear anything about it until the war had been going for a while, and I never quite knew what went on. It's been said that they attacked there and that the North Koreans responded. Well, I don't think that this can hold water because the 17th RCT was in the Ongjin Peninsula, and it would have presented a tremendous line of communication problem had they done an attack to the north.
Of course we know that the North Koreans invaded the South. The question is, what's the meaning of that invasion? In my view, the North Koreans had their tanks greased up, their artillery fused, and their planes ready long before the Korean War began in June 1950. I think what happened, in fact, was that in the summer of 1949, the North Koreans were confronted with a situation where they might well have to fight. In my view, the North Koreans were not ready to fight in the summer of 1949. And I think what they did was to develop a strategy to launch a preemptive assault, or perhaps an assault that came with a minor provocation. Maybe they were waiting for the first southern provocation of the summer of 1950. But in any case, their strategy was a blitzkrieg.
As people fled from the fighting, the North Korean tanks, which the Americans had thought would be useless, thrust towards Seoul. News of the fighting reached Washington on a Saturday evening. Truman and Atchison were out of town. Most top officials seemed unaware of the dangers.
I myself, who was Assistant Secretary for Far Eastern Affairs, was having dinner with the columnist Joseph Alsop, and at that same dinner was Secretary of the Army Frank Pace. And no one had called us to say the North Koreans are about to attack.
An officer came in and conferred with Dean Rusk and myself, advised of what had happened. Both Secretary Atchison and Secretary Johnson were out of the city, and so I went to the Pentagon and Dean went to the State Department, and I stayed there all night.
Atchison raced back to Washington, told Truman there was no need for him to hurry back, and took charge.
At that meeting, the first issue is, do we respond? And I think that was not a difficult proposition. I think it was clearly identified in the minds of almost all of the participants that if we allowed this particular action to move unchallenged, that we faced long-range trouble, particularly with the Soviet Union.
That was the evening in which we decided that the first thing we should do is to take this matter to the United Nations. And so we alerted our people at our delegation at the United Nations to call for a special meeting of the UN Security Council the next day.
The Russians had been boycotting the Security Council because of its refusal to seat Communist China. They failed to return.
I was amazed that the Russians, when they realized what the Security Council was about to do, did not suddenly appear and do something about it. Because if it were true that the Russians were well aware of what was about to happen, it's most unlikely that they would have stayed away from the Security Council that afternoon. I think the Russians were a bit surprised by what happened and didn't get themselves organized in time.
До сих пор and to this day, I still don't understand it. And resent, and consider it a stupid error on our part. We should not have allowed the Security Council, which was wholly pro the USA, to pass a resolution to send troops to Korea under the blue flag of the United Nations.
О том, чтобы послать в Корею войска под голубым флагом ООН.
At midnight yesterday, I was informed that the conflict appeared to have broken out in Korea.
The UN had no independent first-hand account from its own sources in Korea and acted before they confirmed what had happened. It heard South Korean testimony, but not the North. The Security Council condemned the North for aggression and called on it to withdraw. Only the Yugoslavs abstained.
Mr. President, at 4 o'clock in the morning on Sunday, June 25th, Korean time, armed forces from North Korea commenced an unprovoked assault against the territory.
The possibility that this was a civil war was discounted. In the areas the North Koreans occupied, sympathizers emerged to join them, and people's committees were set up. The North Korean army would soon be in the suburbs of Seoul. Some Koreans welcomed it. Some watched and waited. Others fled towards the Han Bridge. Much of the Southern Army was cut off as the key bridge across the Han was prematurely blown. The communists could justifiably believe that the South was there for the taking and that the war was almost over. But it was only just beginning. June the 29th, 1950. Seoul, the capital of South Korea, had fallen to the victorious North Koreans. Half the Southern Army had been destroyed or trapped by the blowing of the bridges across the Han River.
The bridge, of course, was blown too early. Our troops should have had a chance to get across it with their equipment, especially their transport, their artillery. And the best accounts that I got later is that approximately 1,000 people were killed on that bridge. I know I looked at the steel beams and could see the pattern of a body, which is the same as in the atomic blast, how you can see the patterns of objects and all after the blast.
With the South Korean army disintegrating, the U.S. Far Eastern commander, General MacArthur, flew to Korea. He was met by U.S. officials and by the elderly President Syngman Rhee. Rhee knew how to appeal to America's emotions. "We are in a hell of a fix," he told MacArthur. MacArthur decided to see for himself. Disowning responsibility for what had happened, he set his sights on continental horizons.
I watched for an hour the pitiful evidence of the disaster I'd inherited. In that brief interval in the blood-soaked hill, I formulated my plans. They were desperate plans indeed, but I could see no other way except to accept a defeat which would include not only Korea, but all of continental Asia. I hoped by an arrogant display of strength to fool the enemy into a belief that I had greater resources at my disposal than I did.
Less than a year after their army had left, the Americans were coming back. On June the 28th, 3 days after the fighting started, the North's army entered Seoul, 25 miles south of the 38th parallel.
들고 정말 그 날쌔게 내려가서 국기계인데 하늘 높이 공하고 깃발을 휘날리게 됐습니다.
Our gunner sprang off the tank and hoisted the flag of the People's Republic of Korea to the top of the pole.
그때 그 감격이야말로 야, 저는 그
I can still see the